I realized I was already in debt the moment I looked at my reflection and felt guilty for wanting to recognize myself. The night this story truly began, I was standing alone in a borrowed bathroom, the light buzzing faintly overhead, my pulse loud enough to feel in my ears. Someone else's cardigan hung from my shoulders, soft, too soft, and the mirror returned an image that made my breath stall. It wasn't shock that froze me. It was relief. The dangerous kind. The kind that feels like truth arriving without permission. I didn't always know how to name that feeling. For most of my life, I called it curiosity, then confusion, then discipline. I paid it down with effort, with rules, with promises I made to myself in silence. I told myself I was just tired, just imaginative, just lonely. I told myself I was normal because that word felt like shelter. But debts don't disappear just because you refuse to open the envelope. Growing up, I learned early how to disappear inside myself. I learned posture before I learned honesty. I learned how to keep my voice steady, my shoulders squared, my wants trimmed down to something acceptable. People praised me for being grounded, dependable, uncomplicated. If they noticed how carefully I performed those traits, they never said a word. And I never corrected them. The first time I wore something meant for a woman, it wasn't dramatic. There was no music swelling, no revelation cracking the sky open. It was accidental, almost boring. A laundry mix-up. A moment of quiet rebellion against nothing and no one. But when the fabric settled against my skin, something inside me leaned forward, like it had been waiting years for that exact sensation. Not excitement, recognition. As if a part of me had finally been addressed directly. I remember standing very still afterward, afraid that if I moved too quickly, the feeling would evaporate. My mind raced to label it, control it, put it back where it belonged. But my body didn't cooperate. My breathing slowed. My shoulders dropped. I felt aligned. That was the first time I understood that peace could feel unfamiliar. From then on, I lived two lives, though neither felt complete. In the world, I was exactly who I was expected to be. Inside, I carried a growing ledger of moments I didn't allow myself to fully feel. Each glance lingered too long. Each private choice felt like an unpaid balance. I told myself I'd settle it later, when things were simpler, when I was braver, when I could afford the consequences. But identity charges interest. The changes began subtly, the way emotional truths often do. I became hyper-aware of mirrors, of silhouettes in windows, of the way clothing shaped not just my body, but my thoughts. I noticed how differently I moved when I was alone, how my gestures softened when no one was watching. These weren't decisions. They were instincts surfacing after years underwater. The tension wasn't just internal. It followed me into conversations, into rooms filled with people who knew me only by the version I presented. Every compliment felt slightly misplaced, every assumption a quiet misunderstanding I didn't correct. I wasn't lying exactly. I was just withholding context. But the weight of that omission grew heavier with time. The first time someone almost noticed, my heart pounded so hard I thought it would give me away. A comment about my posture. A joke about my sensitivity. Nothing cruel, nothing sharp, but it landed like a warning shot. I laughed it off, the way I always did, but the laughter sounded hollow even to me. I began to understand how fragile my balancing act really was. What scared me most wasn't rejection. It was confirmation. The fear that if I leaned too far into this truth, I wouldn't be able to retreat again. That the person I was becoming wouldn't fit neatly back into the life I'd built. That I would owe explanations I didn't yet have the language to give. And yet, the pull intensified. I started allowing myself small permissions. Neutral clothes that felt just a little different. Changes in grooming that no one could quite pinpoint. Each adjustment brought both comfort and dread, like stepping closer to a ledge just to feel the height. I told myself I was experimenting. I didn't yet admit I was remembering. The night in the borrowed bathroom wasn't the first time I'd crossed that line, but it was the first time I couldn't pretend it was temporary. I looked at my face, softened by the lighting, framed by choices I had once forbidden myself, and something shifted permanently. I didn't see a disguise. I saw a question I could no longer ignore. Who am I paying this debt to? The answer came quietly, without drama. To myself. To every version of me that learned to wait patiently in the dark. To the truth I kept postponing because it didn't fit the schedule of the life I'd planned. I didn't know then how high the cost would be, or how public the payment might become. I only knew that turning back would be more expensive than continuing forward. And that realization, terrifying, grounding, undeniable, was the first real step I ever took toward becoming whole. By the time I accepted that the debt existed, I had already begun making payments without realizing it. It started with awareness that followed me everywhere, like a quiet echo of myself walking half a step behind. I noticed how my emotions surfaced faster than before, how joy and discomfort both arrived with sharper edges. I could no longer numb myself into neutrality. When something felt wrong, it rang inside me like a bell that refused to be silenced. When something felt right, it scared me with its clarity. I told myself I was just becoming more honest, more emotionally present. That explanation felt safe enough to say out loud. What I didn't say was that my sense of self was rearranging itself from the inside, reorganizing priorities I had spent years carefully stacking. I was no longer asking what I should want. I was asking what I already did. The mirror became my most difficult companion. Some days it felt like an adversary, reflecting a version of me that lagged behind my inner sense of alignment. Other days it felt like a negotiation. I would tilt my head, adjust my posture, soften my expression, and catch glimpses, brief, fleeting, of someone closer to the truth I was circling. Those moments never lasted long, but they left a residue of longing that colored the rest of my day. I began to understand that gender, for me, wasn't a performance or a rebellion. It was an emotional gravity. No matter how far I drifted from it, I felt the pull. I resisted calling it anything definitive because names carry consequences, and I wasn't ready to be held accountable by a word. Still, the feeling persisted, patient and unyielding. Social spaces became minefields. I listened more than I spoke, measuring my reactions, editing my instincts. I wondered how much of myself leaked through despite my efforts. I wondered who would notice first, not out of malice, but recognition. That possibility unsettled me more than outright rejection. Being seen felt more dangerous than being judged. I tested boundaries in private first. I let myself explore expressions that felt natural but unfamiliar. Changes in the way I carried myself. The cadence of my thoughts. The emotional permission to feel tenderness without immediately apologizing for it. These were small shifts, nearly invisible to others, but they felt seismic to me. Each one rewrote a rule I had lived by without question. There was guilt threaded through it all. Not shame, something quieter, heavier. Guilt for disrupting the image people had of me. Guilt for wanting something that complicated everything. Guilt for the relief that followed each small act of self-alignment. I felt as though I were borrowing time from a future I hadn't yet explained to anyone, including myself. The debt metaphor returned often. I imagined a balance sheet of my life, with years of compliance neatly logged on one side and moments of authenticity scribbled nervously on the other. The numbers didn't add up anymore. No matter how carefully I behaved, the truth accrued interest faster than denial could offset it. One afternoon, someone close to me asked a simple question: how I was really doing. The kind of question people ask casually, without expecting a real answer. My mouth opened, ready to deliver the usual reassurance, but the words stalled. For a split second, I considered telling the truth, not all of it, but enough to breathe. The moment passed. I smiled, said I was fine, and felt the cost of that choice settle into my chest. That was when I understood the danger of postponement. Each delay made the eventual reckoning heavier. Each later made the truth louder. I wasn't just hiding from others anymore. I was fragmenting myself to maintain a version of stability that no longer fit. The most unexpected change was how compassion entered the equation. I began to feel empathy for my past self, not disdain, not embarrassment, but gratitude. He had done what he knew how to do to survive. He had carried the weight until I was strong enough to notice it. That realization softened something inside me. I wasn't betraying who I had been. I was inheriting what he protected. Still, fear lingered. Fear of loss. Fear of explanation. Fear that stepping further into alignment would mean stepping away from people I loved. I didn't yet know how to reconcile those possibilities. I only knew that pretending ignorance was no longer an option. The debt had reached a point where minimum payments were no longer enough. I didn't announce any of this. I didn't make declarations or dramatic gestures. I simply kept listening to my reactions, my discomforts, my quiet moments of relief. I followed those signals like breadcrumbs through a forest I'd been avoiding for years. Every step forward felt both terrifying and inevitable. And somewhere deep inside, beneath the anxiety and uncertainty, there was a growing steadiness. A sense that no matter how complicated the path ahead became, it would at least be honest. That knowledge didn't erase the fear, but it gave it context. It told me that whatever I owed, whatever it cost, the payment was leading me closer to myself. By the third phase of my quiet unraveling, I could no longer pretend that this was an internal exercise with no external consequences. The world had begun to respond to me differently, even if no one could explain why. Conversations shifted in tone. People lingered on my words, as if listening for something beneath them. I noticed pauses where there hadn't been pauses before, glances that stayed a fraction too long. Nothing overt, nothing provable, but enough to make me aware that whatever was changing inside me was beginning to ripple outward. I became acutely conscious of my body, not in a critical way, but in an observational one. I felt how tension lived in my shoulders, how certain movements felt forced while others felt effortless. I noticed the way I occupied space, how I instinctively made myself smaller in moments of vulnerability and felt strangely powerful when I stopped correcting that instinct. These weren't affectations. They were truths surfacing after years of suppression. I didn't wake up one morning and decide to transform. That narrative is too simple, too clean. What happened instead was a slow recalibration. I stopped fighting certain impulses. I allowed myself to choose comfort over conformity in ways that were invisible to most but monumental to me. The way I selected clothes for how they made me feel rather than how they signaled my role. The way I let my expression soften instead of bracing it into neutrality. Each choice felt like crossing a small bridge with no guarantee the other side would hold. There were days I panicked and tried to pull back. Days when I looked at myself and wondered if I was imagining all of it, if I was constructing meaning where there was only restlessness. On those days, I tried to overcorrect, lower my voice, stiffen my posture, return to familiar habits. But the effect was jarring, like wearing shoes that no longer fit. The discomfort was immediate and undeniable. That's when I realized something unsettling. Repression had once felt like safety, but now it felt like loss. The emotional shifts were the hardest to explain, even to myself. I cried more easily, but the tears didn't feel fragile. They felt cleansing, purposeful. I felt joy more vividly, too, not loud joy, but a warm, steady presence that lingered. It scared me how much emotional range I'd been living without, how narrow my internal world had been when I thought it was complete. I began to grieve things I hadn't lost yet. Relationships that might change. Expectations that might dissolve. A future that no longer looked the way I'd been taught it should. That grief arrived quietly, often when I was alone, and it demanded to be felt. I let it sit with me, heavy but honest. The word female started appearing in my thoughts, not as a declaration, but as a question. I didn't chase it. I didn't reject it. I let it hover. I examined how my body reacted to it, how my emotions responded. There was fear there, yes, but also a strange calm. As if something in me recognized the word even before I consciously accepted its weight. I thought about the stories I'd absorbed growing up, the narrow scripts offered for who I could be. I realized how little room they left for nuance, for evolution, for quiet truths that don't announce themselves dramatically. I wasn't trying to become someone else. I was trying to stop pretending I already was. One evening, alone again, I caught my reflection unexpectedly, not posed, not prepared. Just me, mid-thought, unguarded. And for the first time, the image didn't feel like a compromise. It felt like a draft. Incomplete, yes, but honest. I stood there longer than I meant to, feeling a mix of tenderness and resolve settle into my chest. That was the moment I understood the real tension wasn't between who I was and who I might become. It was between who I was willing to disappoint and who I could no longer betray. The debt wasn't just about gender or presentation. It was about truth deferred for the comfort of others. I didn't yet know how I would navigate the conversations ahead or how visible this journey might become. I only knew that the internal alignment I was experiencing was not reversible. Once you feel what it's like to stop fighting yourself, the cost of returning to denial becomes unbearable. The fear remained, but it changed shape. It was no longer fear of becoming something unknown. It was fear of stopping halfway. Fear of settling for partial honesty when full truth was finally within reach. And beneath all of it, steady and unwavering, was a quiet certainty forming. Not loud enough to announce itself, but strong enough to guide me forward. I didn't know where it would lead, but I trusted it more than the rules I'd been living by. For the first time in my life, I wasn't just paying down a debt. I was investing in myself. By the time the fourth movement of my becoming began, secrecy stopped feeling like protection and started feeling like erosion. It wasn't that I wanted to be seen, not yet, but I was exhausted from constantly managing the distance between who I felt like and who people thought I was. Every interaction required calculation. Every smile carried strategy. I had become fluent in self-editing, and the fluency itself was wearing me down. I didn't realize how heavy that labor was until I briefly imagined putting it down. The first visible changes weren't dramatic. They were almost disappointingly subtle, which somehow made them more frightening. A different way of standing. A gentler pace in how I moved through rooms. A softness in my face that no amount of discipline could fully reverse. These weren't things I practiced. They were things that happened when I stopped correcting myself every second. When I relaxed into my own skin, the truth surfaced naturally. People began responding to me with a new kind of attentiveness. Some grew warmer, more open, as if sensing a vulnerability they felt invited to meet. Others became cautious, confused by the mismatch between the role they'd assigned me and the person unfolding in front of them. No one said anything outright, but the air around me felt charged, as though everyone was unconsciously adjusting their expectations. That unsettled me more than outright confrontation would have. At night, when the world quieted, my thoughts grew louder. I replayed conversations, scanning for moments I might have revealed too much. I questioned every instinct. Was I leaning into this because it felt right, or because I was afraid to confront it fully? Was I brave, or just drifting? Those questions circled endlessly, offering no clean answers. And then there were the moments of undeniable peace. They arrived unexpectedly, often in solitude. I would catch myself moving without tension, breathing without resistance, existing without performance. In those moments, I felt whole in a way I never had before. Not euphoric, grounded. As if my internal compass, long ignored, had finally been recalibrated. That contrast became impossible to ignore. The difference between how I felt when I honored myself and how I felt when I retreated into old habits was stark and immediate. The truth wasn't subtle anymore. It was instructional. Still, fear found new ways to speak. It whispered about permanence, about what could not be undone, about how curiosity could calcify into consequence. I worried that allowing myself this alignment would lock me into a path I wasn't fully prepared to walk. I worried about becoming visible before I felt ready to be understood. The idea of being misunderstood terrified me more than being disliked. Misunderstanding felt like erasure, like being reduced to a simplified narrative that missed the nuance of my journey. I didn't want to be a symbol or a headline. I wanted to be human. There was a particular afternoon when the tension nearly broke me. Someone I trusted made an offhand comment about real men, the words delivered casually, without malice. I felt my body react before my mind could intervene. A tightening in my chest, a sudden heat behind my eyes. I nodded along, smiled faintly, and said nothing. But inside, something fractured. I went home that day feeling hollow. Not angry, tired. Tired of translating myself into something palatable. Tired of carrying a truth that demanded silence. For the first time, I allowed myself to imagine a future where I didn't have to explain every instinct, where my existence didn't require constant justification. That was when the concept of transition stopped feeling abstract. It wasn't about changing my body or rewriting my past. It was about aligning my external life with my internal reality so that I could finally rest. The thought scared me, but it also steadied me, like standing at the edge of a storm and realizing the only way out was through. I didn't rush into decisions. I sat with the idea, examined it from every angle, let my fears speak without letting them dominate. I researched quietly, reflected deeply, and listened to the part of myself that had waited so long to be acknowledged. I treated my own truth with the seriousness it deserved. The debt metaphor shifted again. This wasn't about repayment anymore. It was about responsibility. About caring for the person I was becoming with the same diligence I had once devoted to hiding her. I began to understand that authenticity isn't loud. It doesn't announce itself with certainty or confidence. It arrives gently, persistently, asking only that you stop pretending it isn't there. And once you answer it, even softly, it reshapes everything. I was no longer standing at the threshold out of curiosity. I was standing there because turning back felt like abandoning myself. By the time I crossed into what I now think of as the fifth stretch of this journey, the question was no longer if I would change, but how much truth I was willing to live with at once. There was a strange calm that settled over me, the kind that follows a long internal argument finally reaching a verdict. I didn't feel victorious. I felt accountable, as if a quiet authority inside me had said, "Now that you know, you're responsible for what you do with it." That responsibility was heavier than fear, but it was also steadier. It gave my days a new gravity. I started noticing how much energy I had been spending on maintenance, maintaining appearances, expectations, consistency with a version of myself that no longer existed. When I loosened my grip on that effort, I felt lighter, almost disoriented. There was space in my thoughts I didn't know what to do with at first. Silence where self-monitoring used to be. Into that space came reflection. I thought about my childhood with new eyes, replaying memories not to rewrite them, but to understand them. Moments I had dismissed as irrelevant now glowed with meaning. The times I felt out of place without knowing why. The envy I mistook for admiration. The comfort I felt in softness, in emotional openness, in roles I was subtly discouraged from inhabiting. None of it felt like proof. It felt like context. The body changes, real or perceived, became emotionally significant even when they were subtle. I noticed how my face seemed more expressive when I stopped guarding it. How my posture shifted when I allowed myself to move naturally. How my reflection, though still familiar, felt less adversarial. I wasn't watching myself anymore. I was meeting myself. This terrified me in ways I hadn't anticipated. Not because the changes felt wrong, but because they felt right enough to trust. Trusting myself had never been my strong suit. I had always relied on rules, structures, external validation. Letting my internal sense of alignment lead felt like stepping into fog without a map. And yet, the fog wasn't empty. It was quiet. It was patient. The first deliberate choice I made, one that felt undeniably intentional rather than exploratory, left me shaking afterward. Not because it was drastic, but because it was honest. I remember sitting with the aftershock, waiting for regret to crash in. It didn't. What arrived instead was a deep, unfamiliar relief, like setting down a burden I hadn't realized I was still carrying. That relief scared me more than panic ever had, because relief implied permanence. As days passed, the internal voice I'd once dismissed as intrusive grew clearer, kinder. It didn't demand speed or certainty. It asked for consistency. It asked me not to abandon myself when things became inconvenient. That voice didn't sound like rebellion. It sounded like care. Socially, the pressure increased. I could sense unspoken questions forming around me. Some people grew distant, unsure how to place me. Others leaned closer, intuitively responding to my increased openness. I learned how much of human connection depends on authenticity rather than familiarity. The more real I became, the more polarized reactions grew. That polarization forced another reckoning. I had spent so long trying to be universally acceptable that I had never asked whether that goal was even fair to myself or to others. I was beginning to understand that being known always comes with the risk of being misunderstood. Avoiding that risk had cost me years. There were nights I lay awake, heart racing, imagining conversations I hadn't yet had. I practiced explanations in my head, trying to compress something vast and personal into something digestible. Every attempt felt insufficient. The truth refused to be reduced to a soundbite. It was a lived experience, not a slogan. I mourned that. I mourned the simplicity I would never have again. But I also recognized that simplicity had always been an illusion. My life had only looked uncomplicated from the outside. Inside, it had been a maze. The most profound shift during this period wasn't physical or social, it was ethical. I began to see self-betrayal as a form of harm. Not dramatic, not malicious, but cumulative. Every time I denied myself honesty, I reinforced a belief that my inner life was less important than others' comfort. Once I saw that clearly, I couldn't unsee it. The gender debt, as I'd come to think of it, wasn't something I could pay off in a single act or declaration. It was a series of choices, each one asking whether I would continue to prioritize safety over truth. I didn't always choose perfectly. I hesitated. I backtracked. I doubted. But I no longer disappeared. And that, I think, was the turning point. Not when I became confident. Not when I felt certain. But when I stopped vanishing from my own life. By the sixth stage of this unfolding, I understood that the hardest part was no longer becoming myself. It was letting that self exist in relation to others. Until then, the journey had been largely internal, a negotiation between instinct and fear. Now it demanded translation, presence, the willingness to be perceived without complete control over the narrative. I had spent so long curating myself that the idea of being interpreted freely felt almost reckless. The first time I allowed a crack in the armor, it wasn't planned. It happened in a moment of fatigue, when I simply didn't have the energy to redirect a conversation or soften a reaction. Someone noticed my hesitation, my careful phrasing, the way I seemed both there and not there. They asked if something was changing. I felt my pulse in my throat. I could have deflected. I had done it 1,000 times before. But something in me, stronger than fear, quieter than courage, said no. I didn't offer a confession. I didn't explain my identity in neat terms. I simply said that I was figuring myself out, and that it mattered more than I had let on. The world did not end. The response was imperfect, a mix of confusion and concern, but it wasn't cruel. And in that imperfect reaction, I felt something loosen inside me. I realized I had been bracing for catastrophe, when what awaited me was uncertainty. Uncertainty, I learned, was survivable. That small truth emboldened me. I began allowing myself to exist with less apology. I stopped preemptively minimizing my emotions. I let silence stand where I once filled it with reassurance. These were subtle shifts, but they changed the tone of my interactions. I wasn't asking permission anymore. I was informing the world, gently, that I was no longer invisible to myself. Externally, the changes became more noticeable. Not because I announced them, but because alignment has a way of radiating outward. My expressions grew freer. My voice found a more natural rhythm. I noticed how my reflections seemed to soften not through effort, but through ease. The tension that had once carved itself into my posture was slowly releasing. This was both exhilarating and terrifying, because the more real I became, the less I could retreat. There was no pretending this was a phase or an experiment. The relief I felt was too consistent, too grounded. I had crossed the point where denial offered comfort. Now it only offered distortion. There were moments of grief that surprised me. Grief for the version of me who would never know this ease. Grief for the years spent negotiating with myself instead of listening. Grief for relationships that might never fully adapt. I let myself feel that grief, without turning it into regret. It was part of the cost, and acknowledging it felt honest. I also encountered resistance, not always spoken, but palpable. A shift in how some people treated me, a cautious distance, an attempt to pull me back toward familiarity. I recognized the impulse. Change unsettles systems, and I had been a stable fixture for a long time. My evolution disrupted expectations, and not everyone was prepared to recalibrate. That hurt more than I expected. Not because I needed approval, but because I understood what it meant to struggle with change. I saw my former self reflected in their discomfort. That empathy kept me from hardening, even when I felt misunderstood. I didn't want to trade one form of self-denial for another kind of armor. Through all of this, my inner sense of gender continued to clarify, not as a label demanding allegiance, but as a truth settling into place. Femininity, for me, wasn't about appearance alone. It was about permission. Permission to feel fully, to connect intuitively, to inhabit my body without resistance. It felt less like becoming something new and more like releasing a long-held breath. The debt metaphor evolved one final time during this period. I realized I wasn't repaying anything anymore. I was reconciling accounts, bringing my inner and outer lives into alignment so that neither one carried the burden alone. That reconciliation was delicate work. It required patience, self-forgiveness, and the courage to be inconsistent while learning. There were days I stumbled, days I questioned everything again, days when visibility felt like exposure rather than freedom. But even on those days, I didn't wish to go back. The forward direction had become unmistakable. What surprised me most was how ordinary it all felt once I stopped fighting it. Not easy, but livable. The drama I had imagined gave way to quiet persistence. I wasn't transforming in a blaze of revelation. I was integrating, moment by moment, into a life that finally made sense from the inside. I didn't yet know what the final shape of that life would be. I only knew that for the first time, I trusted myself enough to find out. By the time I reached what I now understand as the final chapter of this journey, I stopped thinking of it as an ending at all. It felt more like arriving at a truth that had been patient enough to wait until I was capable of holding it without fear. There was no single moment of arrival. No dramatic declaration. No sharp line dividing before and after. What changed instead was my relationship to myself. The tension that had once accompanied every decision slowly loosened its grip. I no longer woke each morning bracing for internal conflict. I woke curious, present, aware of my own emotional weather in a way that felt grounding rather than overwhelming. The reflection I met now was still evolving, but it no longer felt like a negotiation. I didn't scan it for discrepancies or measure it against expectations. I saw continuity. I saw someone who had traveled a long distance internally and had finally stopped pretending that the journey was accidental. My features hadn't magically transformed overnight, but my expression had. There was a gentleness there that couldn't be rehearsed. A steadiness that came from no longer arguing with myself. I began to understand that becoming wasn't about replacing one identity with another. It was about honoring the through line, the emotional truth that had existed long before I had language for it. The boy I had been wasn't erased. He was relieved. He had carried the weight until I was ready to set it down. Living more openly didn't solve everything. Some relationships settled into new shapes. Some grew quieter. A few fell away entirely. That loss hurt, but it didn't hollow me out the way I once feared it would. Grief, I learned, is survivable when it isn't paired with self-denial. I could mourn what changed without wishing myself smaller again. What surprised me most was how often I was met with unexpected understanding. Not universal acceptance, nothing so simple, but moments of genuine connection that felt deeper than anything I'd known before. When I spoke from a place of honesty rather than defense, people responded to the humanity in it. Even confusion softened when it wasn't fed by secrecy. I stopped thinking of femininity as something I had to justify. It wasn't a performance or a destination. It was a rhythm I finally allowed myself to follow. The way I listened. The way I expressed care. The way I inhabited emotion without apology. These weren't new traits. They were reclaimed ones. The concept of the gender debt faded as well. Not because it was paid in full, but because I understood it differently. The debt had never been about owing something to the world. It had been about withholding something from myself. Once I stopped doing that, the ledger balanced naturally. There was no dramatic closing of accounts, just equilibrium. Now, when I look back, I don't see a life divided by a single revelation. I see a long arc of quiet courage, of listening when it would have been easier to ignore, of choosing integrity over ease, again and again, until integrity became ease. I see someone who learned that safety built on self-erasure is not safety at all. If this story has a truth worth carrying forward, it's this: identity doesn't demand certainty to be valid. It asks only for honesty. And honesty, even when it complicates things, has a way of simplifying the soul. I am not finished becoming. I don't think any of us are. But I am finished disappearing. I live now with the understanding that my truth is not a disruption. It is a continuity. A promise I finally kept. And when I catch my reflection these days, unexpectedly, unguarded, I no longer feel that old guilt for wanting to recognize myself. I feel gratitude that I finally do.